And I wanted to welcome Heidi.
This meeting is being recorded.
Heidi and Dan to do Owls of Massachusetts as a workshop for the Hampshire Bird Club. They have been owling together from what I can understand for a very long time. And they really enjoy learning lots and lots about these nocturnal predators. They have sort of this fierce competition going on with the Christmas bird count. It seems that each year they try to beat each other on how many owls they can hear. From the rumors, I hear that Heidi wins all the time. I'm not sure if that's true. No. Anyway, welcome. And just let me know when you'd like me to start sharing my screen with the presentation, and I'll do that.
All right, Dan, do you want to start by introducing yourself? We can introduce ourselves and say why we're here.
Sure. I'm Dan Ziomek, somewhat of a Hampshire Bird Club member, but not currently. Life gets in the way, as most people know. But I've been owling pretty much since I was a teenager. I started bird count probably 35 years ago. I wasn't a competitor of Heidi's back then. My brother Dave kind of ran the territory, so he was in charge, and then I took it over. And that's when I found out Heidi was getting these huge numbers over in Hatfield, and I said, I got to do something to try and compete. So I became a more avid owler, and perfected my recordings and worked on my barred owl call and did everything I could to get my numbers up, including tying a few owls to trees. Anyway, owling is something that really interests me. I enjoy going out during the night. I still go out early morning now in the dark with no light or anything, just in the hopes of hearing or seeing barred owls, great horned owls. There aren't many screech owls around my house. My wife thinks I'm crazy for going out in the dark, but it's one of my favorite times of the morning is when it's nice and quiet and you can hear and see everything. So that's my story. Heidi has her own story, so I'll let her chime in.
All right, so I'm Heidi Stemple, and I'm definitely an owler, and I'm a very competitive with Dan only owler. But my background isn't in birding so much as it is in children's books. So I'm actually an author. That's my profession. And I write a lot of books about birds. My newest one is a tiny little one called Whose Nest is Best. But if you know anything about children's books, you may know me from a very famous one called Owl Moon, which is written by Jane Yolen, who is my mother. And it's about a little girl and her dad who go out owling. And the little girl is me. My dad was the one who taught me and both of my brothers to owl. And I have been also owling since I was a very young kid. My dad used to take us out doing all sorts of crazy things in the name of finding birds. So I'd like to tell people that I was placed inside his waders when he would go out. That's how small I was when he started taking us out birding. But my dad, when I moved back home, because I was gone for a while, I was living down in the South. When I came back home, my dad and I picked up doing the owl calling of the Christmas bird count as well as the day count. And unfortunately, 4 years after that, he died and I took over his territory. I didn't go back to birding right away, and I'm just slowly getting back into it, but I never stopped owling because I knew I needed to do that because it was his territory and I needed to owl the territory. And I have lots of fun stories about both being out with him and being exhausted and not loving it so much, and then growing back into it as the leader of a team. Now, Dan and I are right across the river from each other. There are moments in the middle of the night during the Christmas bird count where I can hear him on one side of the river, and we have to decide whether it's Dan or an owl over there, and whether I should text him to say, you've got a great horned owl over on your side, or whether it's just him calling. But I have been owling the Audubon Christmas bird count for many years. I used to always beat Dan, but then he got much more competitive. And I think you've taken us in the last 2 or 3 years. Definitely. Maybe even 4. You see how this can
We're
be
doing better.
So I owl with a team of friends who love to be out with us, and we actually call ourselves the OMG, the Owl Moon Gang. So on our best night, we called down 67 owls. And I have not come close to that since, but it does really depend on the roads. And I think we'll talk a little bit about the road condition when we're talking about owling at some point this evening. And I look forward every year to doing it. People think we're crazy, you know, just like Dan, people think I'm crazy because I like to do it. And it is sort of an extreme sport, owling, the Audubon Christmas bird count. And the one thing I do want to mention is that I'm a bit of a specialist. I don't bird a lot. I bird whenever I see a bird. I always have binoculars with me. I go to Maine a lot now on a ferry, and I carry binoculars, so I hand them to children on the boat. Here, why don't you look in these? And so that you can see the osprey nest over there. But I wouldn't say that I am a completely avid birder, but I am very determined to make sure that kids understand the fun of birding. And that's been, I think, something that Dan and I have in common. You've been running a bunch of kids, not bird counts, but owl prowls. And one of the things I'm most proud of is that after I wrote a book about the Audubon Christmas bird count, I got started here in Hampshire County, the first kids and family portion of the Audubon Christmas bird count. So that's my whole history. And we can talk more about any of those things. And I do want to tell everybody I have the chat open. If you have a specific question for either one of us, if it's for Dan, I will read it out to him. I don't know if you have the chat open or not, Dan, but go on. I'm going to take your lead, Dan. Except if you're frozen, because if you're frozen, you can't lead us.
Okay. No, I'm not frozen anymore. So I just wanted to, when I go out on the Christmas bird count, my team consists of David P. Jones and sometimes Hobie Island. So we don't have quite the team that Heidi does. She has a lot more ears and eyes out there than David P. Jones and I do. That's why her numbers are so high. But we can go ahead and start the PowerPoint anytime. Laura?
Yes.
So I just want to start by, if you want to play the second slide, Laura, giving credit to Scott Cerner because he took all of these photographs. And many people know Scott takes beautiful pictures, and he provided all these to me. So I do want to give him credit for these. So we can go ahead on to the next one. So I want to start with screech owl because that's the owl that Heidi and I are most often out there looking to call in and count. That's where our numbers come from. This little guy, as you can see, will use nest boxes, but they are cavity nesters. So they love sycamore trees. Silver maples often have cavities in them. And these trees are found primarily along river bottoms. So most of our screech owl hunting, at least for me and I think for Heidi as well, is where there's water, whether it's moving water or standing water. Screech owls are most often found near water. Their prey also needs to drink, and especially in the winter when there's lots of snow on the ground, having their prey come out exposed to get a drink of water gives the screech owls a better chance to catch their prey and feed during the night. I'm coming two color phases. This happens to be a red phase here in this box. I think the next slide shows a picture of a gray phase, but I'm not positive. There you go. They're gray. Screech owls are true for Heidi as well. Occasionally we'll have a pair come in that is both red and gray, but that's unusual. More often than not, you get two grays or two reds. Anything else you want to add, Heidi?
Well, one of the reasons why we, the two of us have a lot of screech owls in our territory is the territory. As I said, we're right across the river from each other. So we're kind of in that perfect zone for screech owls. There's a lot of trees with cavities. It lines the water, the Connecticut River. We're on either side of it. There's tributaries all around. And it loves the wide open farmland also for hunting. So we sort of sit just in the right place for screech owls. And that is where we do get our big numbers when calling. And people always ask me, how do I know that we're not calling the same screech owl? And screech owls are, of course, smaller, so they have slightly smaller territories. So when I call an owl, I listen for the one screech owl. And if we hear one, we like to try and make it two. So if I hear one over on this side, and then I hear one on the other side calling at the same time, or if I hear them duetting, which is, I love words, obviously, and duetting is such a wonderful way to think about them. We can count those as two. Sometimes I'll get a great area where we hear 3 or even 4 calling all at the same time from different areas. So that's important to know how we do the counting and why our numbers can be so high, because sort of their territories are a bit smaller. And I assume this is the same with you, Dan. I have been owling this territory for so long, so I kind of know where the resident screech owls are. And what's my favorite part about screech owls is they often have a very unique voice or personality, and you can come back year after year and hear that same one. I know that there's one with a very distinct hiccup in its whinny. The call of a screech owl is called the whinny. And it has a very little hiccup in it. And I love to hear that same bird year after year, or the descendants with the same hiccup. I don't think that's actually true, but it's a funny little quirk, I think, of screech owls. Do you find that as well, Dan?
I do. The really quiet ones that you know are going to be quiet, so you listen a little harder. And occasionally there are aggressive ones who will come in and fly into the recording. I remember being at the north end of North Hadley Pond, and my friend Tom Clark was with me, and he had a really good screech owl whistle that he could do with his own voice. And 2 years in a row, the screech owl flew in and hit him in the head. That's how good his call was. I'm not that good, so I use a recording, and maybe the birds aren't as aggressive for recordings, but they will fly through to see if there's a competitor in their territory, and you know where those aggressive ones are.
Yep, I have an aggressive one who dive bombs my head every time, but I have never been hit by one, thankfully. I also wear a really, really thick hat for that purpose. Let's answer the question about, I mean, it's not actually an actual question. I'm just going to throw out a question. You use recording. Somebody has their line open and I'm hearing a buzz. I don't know if that's helpful for anybody. You use a recording. Have you always used a recording?
I have always used a recording, and way back when it was tape recordings that we made from the old Roger Torrey Peterson album. We would play the owl call over and over again and create breaks in the tape recording so we could listen. That's the problem with using cell phones and technology, is there's no listening breaks now in my recordings. So I have to turn it off and listen, because oftentimes when the recording is playing, you can't hear the owl calling if they're really quiet. So that's one thing I've noticed moving up in technology to cell phones. That is a little bit of a problem for me.
Interesting. So what I also remember when we were using tape recorders, and the funny thing about that is my dad was in charge of the recordings, obviously. And I kept knitting him and sewing him cozies to put his Walkman in, because the batteries that ran them would freeze. So if you had a really cold night, you had to have it closed in, and I would knit him stuff to keep it warm and close to his body so that he could turn it on and off on the recordings. I actually don't generally use my cell phone. Instead, I have one tiny little, one day it's going to break and I will be sad, an iPod that just has bird recordings on, and I wear a speaker around my neck. So it's a very funny thing. But we did used to call, we used to call ourselves. And what we found, the year that my dad, and he actually went around the internet, and this was so early, he went around the internet and asked people if he could use their recordings, and they would send him recordings, which he would then put on his recorder. And I actually, in just a love thing, I still use his same recordings, although I've transferred them digitally. But when we switched over to using recordings from calling them by whistling, they came so much faster. And there was a jump in how many we could count that year. And it went from somewhere in the 18, 19 range, I think, for the night. We jumped to 34, which was the highest we'd ever been. And it was just absolutely amazing how much quicker they came to an actual owl for us. So it's interesting that you have the opposite. But when we call them in, I will often chat with them by whistling. So I do a screech. I can't do a great horn. I do a great screech and an adequate bard, but never my great horn is terrible. And I was told that by Tom Riccardi, so I know it's true.
Okay. One funny story that I'll relate about screech owls from a few years ago. Dave and I were out on what started as a snowy night and turned into a rainy night, and we're up at the north of our territory in Sunderland, and we were going to drive out in the farm fields. I have a 4-wheel drive truck, and I said, "Oh, we can make it." And it was a little slippery going out. And I said, I think we're still good. I think we're still good. And we no sooner got into the next field closer to where we wanted to play the recording than I broke through the frozen ground just into sloppy, greasy mud at 2:00 in the morning. And we were probably half a mile off the road, at least a quarter mile off the road. And I'm like, oh, you know what? What do you do at 2:00 in the morning? You're out in somebody else's field where you probably shouldn't be. I don't call the police. Who else is up at this hour? Heidi Stemple. And luckily, Heidi came prepared with boards and shovels and all that kind of thing, which David and I didn't have. And because it was a rainy night and the owls weren't all that great, Heidi broke away and came over and rescued me from the fields of Sunderland with her boards. It did take us about 45 minutes, and David and I at least, and I think some of Heidi's crew were covered in mud and soaking wet by the time we were done. We didn't give up owling. We still managed to get 4 or 5 owls that night, but it was not a fun owling night for sure. Thank you, Heidi.
Those things happen, and I was prepared not to tell that story. I know how much you love that story. So I was prepared definitely not to tell it, but it was
kind of funny now that I look back.
Yeah, I have pictures, but I don't have them queued up, but that was a great, it was a wonderful night of camaraderie is what it was.
Yes.
And it's true. And if anybody here has done the Christmas bird count, you know, everybody gets stuck. I've been stuck teetering on an ice bank when someone yelled fox, and I whipped the Subaru around and put it up on a snowbank where the car was here on a snowbank. So that was fun. And I've gotten caught a couple times. But when we were that night telling stories and compiling, all the women said the same thing. Oh, of course you had all the stuff in your car. No woman is going to go out in the middle of the field and not have boards and sand and an axe and bolt cutters and buckets of cat litter and all the stuff that you need for getting stuck. So,
all right, why don't we show the next slide? The great horned owl, we just touched on a minute ago. So generally speaking, and I think this is the same for Heidi, we don't call in great horned owls on the Christmas bird count. In December, when we do the count, they are just calling because they are forming territories at that time of year. And great horned owls have a relatively large territory. Some people say 5 miles in diameter. the male will actively defend from other great horned owls. And right now, the female should be sitting on eggs, if not chicks, at this point, because they lay their eggs in January. And I often tell the story when I'm doing owl prowls that they do this so that the young can fly when rabbits are having babies, so that the young can learn to hunt on baby rabbits instead of adult rabbits. I may be off base on this, but that's what I've heard. This is a very aggressive owl, not only against other owls, but near the nest. It can be aggressive towards people as well. If anybody's read Bag and Elliot, the old book from the 1930s, they talk about eggs, harvesters being attacked, climbing great horned owl trees and that kind of thing. Right now, they're starting to call again. I've noticed a little bit more. I hear them almost every morning now, at least the male, occasionally the female as well. To me, that means chicks are hatched and both parents are out hunting again. And they will nest almost anywhere except for really, really deep forests. They prefer somewhat thinned out forests, and that's one thing we noticed on the quabbin count is that we're getting more great horned owls out around the quabbin where it used to be all barred owls, and that's because they've done so much logging out there. This is one of the largest owls we get here in Western Mass, and they're very loud. And again, as Heidi mentioned earlier, oftentimes we'll hear great horns on the Hatfield side of the river, or we'll hear great horns in somebody else's territory on the Hadley side of the river. And we have to be careful not to overcount great horned owls because of how far their calls will carry. And most people know their call. The male is whoo, 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 and the female is the deeper whoo, 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 whoo. And the female's deeper in voice because it's bigger in size. It's a third bigger than the male great horned owl, and that's because she defends the nest almost entirely. Anything else to add, Heidi?
Well, I love that you answered the question because Andrea had the question, how do you tell the difference between the male and female great horned owl calls? When you hear them together, they almost don't sound like the same species. The female is so much lower. And if you do see them side by side, they're that much bigger. I actually have a nesting pair outside. I'm pointing that way because it's literally out the door right there, outside, and you can hear them in your house with everything closed up in the winter. And as Dan said, we don't call for them because they don't really answer you so much, but if they're out, you will hear them calling in December. And that's sort of the way everybody feels about the great horns, I think. I mean, that's the way I was taught to call, is we call the screech and we call the barred, but we just listen for the great horned. And the big territories is why we don't have quite as big numbers as the screech owls. But for me, I know where my nesting pairs are. Oh, I can't tell, somebody's unmuting. I know where my nesting pairs are in my territory because I've owled this territory for a while, and we do scout in the morning. We look to see if there are new nests as well, and we listen for those.
Maybe five, like it's always five. Athleticism allows them so to fourth and fifth they can pay. Stop on a dime and time, pull up mid-range, shoot the three, get all the way to the rim, finish with authority, dunk on guys. I mean, we see this since he came into the league, the way he can finish at the rim.
If everyone could make sure to mute themselves.
Yeah, I know, I will. You have that type of talent.
I'm trying to see who it is. Okay, I think somebody did it. All right. So we were talking about territories of the great horned owl. The other reason why I try not to bring in great horned owls, even if I did think I could, is that I am communicating with screech owls. And screech owls very easily would become prey for great horned owls. So I don't want to notify, I don't want to announce where the screech owls are to the great horned owls just for their safety. So that's something else we've always been really conscious of. If we have a screech around, we don't even call for the larger barred owls, just to keep them as safe as possible. Is that the same with
And
you?
that brings up, that is the same, and it brings up another good point about lighting owls, because we do occasionally put flashlights on to the owls to try and figure out what color phase they are and that kind of thing. So we don't want to keep the light on them for very long, because again, this gives the larger owls a better chance at catching screech owls. We've had barred owls come in unannounced to try and catch the screech owls that we're talking to. Not so much great horns, but definitely barred owls will come in unannounced and try to grab that screech owl that we're talking to. So we are careful not to play the recording too long and to not light them too long. So that's what I would bring up. Another thing about great horned owls that a lot of people don't know is that they are one of the few birds of prey that will take skunks. And that's because they have a very poor sense of smell, and they will kill them instantly and hopefully not get sprayed in the process. But they really can't smell it anyway. But they like squirrels, skunks, much larger prey than screech owls or even barred owls tend to take.
And house cats. Keep your cats inside.
Yes.
Keep your cats inside for their own safety, the safety of all the birds. Yes, they do love a skunk sometimes, and this is rumory. I don't know this for a fact, but I have heard people say that they smelled an odor of skunk, and when they got up into the area, it was because there were great horned owl nests, and since they'd been tearing apart skunks. And actually, I think a raptor rehabber once told me she'd been up in one of the nests and it really smelled quite skunky. So I thought that was a fun fact. And we do, the PowerPoint is Dan's, so I don't actually know. We do have another owl. Did you have any short-eared owls here? Or sorry, long-eared owls in the presentation?
I think there is later on. We're going to talk about the most common owls first. Long-eared is a rare owl for us around here. So we'll talk about that. As far as looks compare, great horns are much heavier and plumper than a long-eared owl. I think of a long-eared owl as being very narrow. Great horns will show their tufts, I think, more than a long-eared will. But again, we rarely see them close enough to even see the tufts. On either species, unless you're down at Plum Island or Salisbury, where there are a few of them roosting in a tree. Interesting about great horns is that twice this year I've had pairs fighting over territory up here on Station Road near Lawrence Swamp, to the point where all four owls were within 300 yards of each other, and I could see two of the four hooting back at the other two, saying, whose territory is this? So they do get rather aggressive with their territory as it gets closer to nesting season.
Dan, we've got a couple questions. Let me pose this one to you, because this is not where I have any expertise. Why do screech owls like sycamore trees? Any idea on the answer to that?
Well, if you've been out in the woods at all and seen a larger sycamore, oftentimes branches break off of sycamores, and what's left where the branch broke off is a cavity. And occasionally pileated woodpeckers will make these cavities as well. And both screech owls and wood ducks will use these cavities to nest in. I know there's a famous screech owl over near Arcadia in East Hampton that uses a sycamore right near the oxbow. Or right on the way into Arcadia, just next to the bridge. And it will sit there on sunny days. I know John Green has photographed that bird many times, but it's because they get large cavities where branches break off. That's why screech owls like sycamores.
That's a great answer.
And they grow along river bottoms. They grow along river bottoms, which is where the screech owl wants to be.
Excellent. All right. Other question that came in, flashlights. Talk about which flashlights not to use for fear of blinding the birds. Also, is a red filter useful out there in trying to find the owls? Now, I have read, and so we use that the red filter doesn't do as much damage to their eyes. It's a little easier on them. You don't want to blind the little bird, especially the small ones, because you want them to be able to easily get back. So we do use the red flashlights to spotlight the birds when we look at them. We do it for a very short time. We do it mostly because we're out there and we are doing all this work, and it's a little kind of bonus for us. Often the birds will turn away from you, so a lot of the time you are not flashing in their eyes, which is good, and we never leave it up for any length of time. Dan, do you use a red flashlight? Anything?
David P. Jones does have a red flashlight, I believe. I do not. What I try to do is not shine it directly on the bird, either shine it just below the bird or off to one side of the bird, so that I am not shining it directly in its eyes, just enough and just long enough to identify the red or gray, and then I turn it off, again, to avoid predators.
I try and do a little bit of video because I am bringing those videos to children to show them the owls, but I do, again, very short. And sometimes my videos are in the complete dark, so they're just really audios.
Yeah.
Good question though, Joseph. Thank you. All right. New bird.
Yep. Next slide. The barred owl. One of my favorites. I have lots of them here in Lawrence Swamp around me. We're one short because one was hit by a car just last weekend, unfortunately. And that's probably the bane of barred owls' existence, is they hunt along roads a lot and fly low over the road to catch prey, and unfortunately get hit by cars and trucks quite often. Last time I talked to Tom Riccardi, that was much earlier this winter before he had the tree damage. I think he had picked up 30 barred owls already this year, and he thought there was quite an influx of barred owls from up north, and that's why his numbers were so high. He's picking them up for multiple reasons. By cars is probably the first reason, but starvation is another reason. These birds don't hunt well in deep snow or crusty snow, and therefore when we have those conditions, they struggle to feed themselves, and oftentimes Tom finds them very malnourished, unfortunately. And we had that about 2-3 years ago when we had that big influx of barred owls where they seemed to be on every street corner. There was a lot of starving birds that year as well. The other thing that's going on with barred owls, and people may not know it, is that they are getting conjunctivitis, unfortunately. And this is the eye disease that affects goldfinches and house finches, makes them unable to see, kind of crust their eyes over. And unfortunately, barred owls are getting this as well. Tom is trying to figure out why or how. He thinks it's something environmentally related. He sent a few specimens off to Tufts to let them dissect them and see if they can figure it out. And he's also had some bald eagles with conjunctivitis as well. So that's a sad thing to report on barred owls. Their numbers seem to be doing okay. Most people know their call, ooh, 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 and they will do all different variations of that call. They'll do parts of it. They'll just say, woo, quite often. Or if you get a few of them together, they'll do what my kids used to call the monkey calls, where they start hooting and hawing and doing all kinds of ups and downs and that kind of thing.
That's my imitation of monkey
You
call.
got it down pat. Yeah.
That's not great horn.
They have about a mile wide territory that they will defend. They will live within a great horned owl's habitat, but they become more secretive within that great horned owl's habitat. And I know from experience down here, if the great horned owls are calling anywhere nearby, you will not get a barred owl to call. They are that afraid of great horned owls because great horns will eat barred owls. I think the next slide is barred owl as well. So if you want to try that one, Laura.
They are significant.
Another great shot of Scott.
Yeah, I was going to say they are significantly smaller, even though they look large, than the great horned, and they are significantly lighter, which is why they have such trouble feeding and finding through that hard packed snow or snow with an ice crust to it. They just simply can't get through it. You were just saying about that before.
Right. What was I going to say?
Oops, sorry. Got you off
I
track.
had a train of thought going there. Oh, I was going to talk about barred owls and calling. Temperature wise, oftentimes I will say that barred owls won't call below 20 degrees. It might be a little bit lower than that, but they are very cold sensitive, and they won't call when it's really cold. So depending on what we hit for a Christmas now, this year there was good numbers of barred owls because it was a relatively warm night. But if we get a 10-degree night or a below zero night, even worse, forget about barred owls. They just won't respond in that kind of condition. The other thing is that, and I know this from my owl prowls for Hitchcock Center, they're kind of the bane of my existence because I can spend 15 or 20 minutes calling a barred owl where I know there is barred owls, heard them the night before, and they won't respond. Or they'll fly in and stare at you and not respond. And I've had that happen many times. On a moonlit night, you can occasionally see them fly in, but more often than not, they're silent. I had one just 2 days ago fly from one side of Station Road over to the Belchertown side. I was fortunate enough that I happened to be looking in that direction. Otherwise, I never would have known the barred owl was there. So they are rather elusive and secretive. But when you get the right night, let's say in April, when they're thinking about breeding, they can be raucous and loud. And I can probably speak to that as well.
Well, I do have barred in my backyard. I sit on 15 acres and we have water in the back. So I have all the owls here. I have our great horned pair who are quite vocal. I have barred here. I have never once heard a barred owl call at my house, but I will occasionally see them. And I have screech, who are vocal mostly in the spring, occasionally in the winter. So yeah, the barred owl, again, the exact same thing. I see them occasionally and I almost never hear them. Almost never. I had one fly out of our barn the other day, right into a tree by the window, and then across to Smith Academy, never made a sound. So yeah, they are the bane of.
And barred owls can be rather, yeah, barred owls can be rather tame at times as well. We had one a week ago sitting on our deck looking at the bird feeders next door, and occasionally you'll find them on a warm sunny day in the middle of winter just kind of sunbathing on a branch, you know, kind of hidden from the crows and that kind of thing, but they'll just close their eyes and take a nap. So if you're fortunate enough to find that, count yourself lucky. You want to show the next slide, Laura? I think it's barred owl as well. Sure is. And that's your typical view of a barred owl in the springtime. Leaves are coming out, as you can see in the background, warm, sunny day. And they're active, especially on cloudy days, throughout the day. They don't just sleep like great horned owls do or screech owls do. They will hunt throughout the day if given the opportunity.
Often,
All right, Laura.
Often if they're hunting during the day, doesn't it mean that they're not getting enough at night? Or is that?
That's for sure in the wintertime for sure, less so in the springtime. If they're hunting during the day in the winter, they're starving for sure.
Yeah. So don't disturb them if you see them trying to hunt.
Right. Saw-whet owl. Another hard one for us to get down here in the valley, a little more common out around the Quabbin. They tend to like boreal forests, which means firs and pines and spruces, which we don't have very big concentrations of those down here in the valley. It's not to say you can't get a saw-whet owl down here. It's just a little more difficult. These guys are tiny. They're only about 6 inches from the top of their head to the tip of their tail, but they are voracious hunters of mice and voles. They've been known to eat 3 or 4 in a night. They will respond to recordings. They have the characteristic tooting which they will do over and over again for 30 seconds or more. I had a pair outside the house here all last winter, and I heard them most nights. Scott came over and heard them as well. So they are around, but they're not as common as the other three species and more secretive. Now we have a banding station over in Belchertown where in the fall they band quite a few saw-whet owls migrating south because they are one of the few migratory owls that we get around here. And I know that probably 20 for the country of saw-whet owls in the Quabbin. Scott can call me on that if it's not true, but we had something like 50 or 60 saw-whet owls on the Quabbin count that year, which was a high count for the country. So they are around, but rather hard to hear and see. They will respond to screech owl calls as well. I was on an owl prowl 2 years ago in Hadley and playing the screech owl call, and a saw-whet responded. So they're not very particular as to which call they will respond to.
I love that. We occasionally when it's wet and there's not enough snow or it's not cold enough, as witnessed by Dan's mud sinkhole we try in Hatfield to get to our sort of higher grounds in our territory. So some years we have gone specifically looking to find if we could fill in our count with northern saw-whets, and I have never been able to call one up. I just don't think that the places that I go are just the right territory. I know they're here. I know that I have heard them in Hatfield, but just not for so long. We do have a question come in. Best hour owl. This one's a hard one. Best hours to owl: evening, night, or early morning? Dan?
All right, I'll take that one for sure. So I do my owl prowls for the Hitchcock Center between 8 and 10. And one of the first things I say to the group before we even go out owling is that between 8 and 10 is not a great time to go out owling. Right after the sun goes down, these birds are thinking about feeding themselves, and they're less responsive to the calls that we produce and try to attract them with than they are, say, at midnight when they're sitting with a full belly after feeding and just kind of hanging out, waiting for you to play a recording and respond back. So definitely from midnight to 6 a.m. or whenever daylight is probably the best time. And that's why we start on the Christmas bird count at midnight. Also, so we can make it to all of our stops. I'm not sure how many stops Heidi makes in a night, but I think David and I average between 35 and 40 stops in a night. We only spend about 5 minutes at each stop. If the owl calls, great. If it doesn't, we're on to the next one. Otherwise, we won't get to all of our stops in that 6-hour time frame. So definitely morning is the time. When I go out with the dog at 5 or 6 in the morning, I almost always hear and or see owls. I'm sure Heidi is the same way.
Yep. We do have years where nothing calls till 2. We do have a sort of a 2-hour don't get frustrated policy in my car, because a lot of times we'll get out excited at midnight and we just hear nothing on all of our regular stops until 2. And then at 2, they start calling. There's a beautiful moment pre-dawn. The temperature drops about 10 degrees. I don't know. I always thought it was sort of my body just saying it's too cold, but there is an actual temperature drop just before dawn where you hear a lot of owls call. If you can make it that long over the night, that seems to be a really great time. And we have them here call right up. And this is, remember, right at around Christmas, the middle of December, the late December, that we have, they call right up until 7:30 in the morning. So we have some spots that I know are so reliable that we get there at 7:30 in the morning every year. And we still are getting the 3 or 4 owls that we know are residents there. Now, that being said, for the last couple months, I've had the owls in my backyard, the great horns, have been calling pre-dusk. So just at 4:30, 5 o'clock every night, which has been fun. And in the spring, I have just as the sun starts to go down, 7, 8, 9 in the spring, so it's much later sundown. I have the screech owls call every night in the backyard. So it really does depend on the season. But I'm mostly calling. Again, I'm a specialist. I call for the Audubon Christmas bird count, and I'd say the best time is between 2 and 7 a.m. Oh,
I agree. I saw a question come in about how long do you play the recording? So for me, that varies. When I'm out on the Christmas bird count, as I just mentioned, David and I play it for 5 minutes, probably maximum. And then we move on. If we don't hear anything in that time frame, we're out of there. We're on to the next stop. However, when I'm out with a group for the Hitchcock Center and trying to hear or see as many owls as I can in 2 hours, I will often let the recording play a little bit longer in a spot where I know there's screech owls. And that's because I know that between 8 and 10 is not the best time. So I put a little more effort into it to try and get an owl to come out. So these folks will be satisfied that I did my job.
I definitely.
I don't know if you're the same, Heidi.
Nope, not at all. Our rule is we call for longer than it feels appropriate, and we wait for longer than it feels comfortable, and then we play again. So we actually have found a lot of the owls where because if you've owled the same territory for a long time, I know 100% that there are owls at the Hatfield boat dock at the boat launch. I know they're screeching. There's no reason for me to give up if I've just played for 5 minutes, because I know damn well there are birds there. So I will put in extra time in a spot that I know is always productive. Underwater Bridge, it's an old town where, if you know all the silly names for them. And so the spots where I know they are, I will put in more time. And then often I will have brought in more than just one bird, so that it makes it more productive for me in that manner. Did I just give away all my secrets? Now you're just going to get even more birds. Beat me even better.
I'm going to try.
All right, we have a couple more.
I saw a couple more.
Do you find daytime searching for pellets under feeding trees to be a useful technique for locating owls? If so, are there any tips to locate such trees? I've never done that, so I can't answer. Do you have any answer for that, Dan? Owl pellets.
I've never done that as well. I always like finding pellets. I usually don't touch them. I don't think of them as the tree to go to call an owl in or anything like that. More often than not, they produce these pellets during the daylight hours when they're resting. So it's not necessarily where they're going to be at night. So I wouldn't use it as a tool to find owls, but to know that they're in the general area.
All right. And the other question that came in, and I love this one. What do you do if you get a neighborhood dog barking in their houses? And for me, I try to, if I'm going to be close to any houses, we both live in areas where you can get really far away from houses. And I don't tend to call too close to anybody's houses. But when I'm going to people's driveways, they know. I've talked to them already. They know that my crew and I are going to be there and approximately what time I'll be there. And sometimes they come out to join us. So I try not to put myself in a position. There's a couple places I'd like to be in closer to houses, especially in the spots where we go at midnight. We sort of gauge it. Are their lights still on? We don't know if they're early morning people or late night people. So we try to stay away from the houses as much as possible. And the reason that I do that is because I am a woman who lives by myself in a house, which is out sort of in the woods. And if somebody was in my backyard calling for owls at 3 o'clock in the morning, I would be terrified. So I just try and do that. And if I heard a dog barking, I'd probably just pack my stuff up and move to the next thing, apologize to the universe and move on. Dan?
Yeah, we don't have many locations where we go where we have dog issues. More often than not, when you're hooting for barred owl or occasionally if you're hooting for great horned owl, you'll wake up dogs and they'll respond to you. I know I have that happen down when I try in the morning to wake up a barred owl or a great horned owl, a dog will respond. But quite often what we do run into is coyotes responding to our calls. And they don't bother us at all, but they definitely know when they're out there, and they'll respond to barred owl calls in particular.
I can tell you that they bother me. I stay pretty close to
They
my
bother
car.
you.
They've never actually tried to bother me, but they do bother me. I don't,
Yeah.
I tend to keep the car as close to us as possible, just in case, because there's been a couple times, one time a barred owl swooped in. We didn't see the owl, but it screamed at us. And when I say screamed at us, if you've never heard a barred owl scream, it is Freddy Krueger level terror. So it just, and we jumped in. Lynn, who's one of my owlers, and I jumped in the van so fast, as if there was a serial killer coming. So I try to stay, I know what's out there. I try to stay close. There's also other fun things. Beavers like to slap their tails at the owl calls. And some nights, if there's a lot of ice in the river, the ice cracking is a very, very disconcerting noise. So the coyotes bother me.
I agree with you there. All right, what's the next slide? There's our long-eared owl. I forget who was asking about that. But you can see from this slide, I mean, again, don't get many long-eareds out here in Western Mass. Apparently there was a nest somewhere in an Amherst Conservation Area, according to Larry Therian last year. I don't know where. But these guys are primarily coastal for us here in Massachusetts. I can remember going to Plum Island with Jerry Bazzo back when I was in junior high school, and there would be a roostery out in the middle of the salt marsh, and you'd see 3 or 4 long-eared owls roosting together in one of these pine trees out in the middle of the salt marsh. Smaller face, smaller body than the great horn. Very secretive, and they have a one hoot, hoo, rather than that booming voice of the great horned owl. I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, we had one on the Smith College campus. A lot of people got to see. So whenever there's one local, I would make every attempt to see it if you can, because otherwise you got to travel to really see long-eared owls.
I have seen 2 in Hatfield. There's one there's one resident in Hatfield, but the homeowners don't want it to be logged. So
Yeah.
So
Right.
This does bring up a question. When we do have rare birds around, who is it that, what is the birding etiquette about it? If it's on somebody's property, they have every right not to share that information. And it's an interesting dilemma. We have, birding rules and conduct, and unfortunately, sometimes people don't follow them, and homeowners who have birds on their property want to protect the birds from the birders. It's interesting. I don't remember it being like that when I was a kid, and my dad had a phone tree, an actual phone tree of calling people with rare birds. But because we have the information so at our fingertips, more and more people can find these birds, and how far away should you remain from them if you're photographing them, and how many people should you tell lest so many people show up? I don't know if you have feelings about that, Dan. Are you just mad because
I do, and
go ahead.
I've kind of grown up in the birding community, from Jerry Bazzo at the junior high school to riding in the back of Scott's Ford Fiesta before I could drive, to Plum Island and elsewhere to see birds. And it just seems like with this age, and no offense to you photographers out there, this age of photography birding, the etiquette stuff has kind of gone out the window. We no longer look at birds from a long distance with binoculars or telescopes like we used to do. Now we get as close as possible to get the best shot possible with our camera, even though we have a 500 millimeter lens on that camera. It seems like we need to be 3 feet from the bird to use that lens. And I think that's where some of the ethics stuff has gone out the window, but that's just my personal opinion.
I think you're spot on. We did have a question and I answered it in the chat, but do you want to confirm this? We do not have barn owls here anymore, do we?
I think we show a slide that we do not, unfortunately, and that's mostly because of their lack of cold hardiness. Barn owls are not very cold hardy. They don't survive well in our winters. The last nesting pair was on Martha's Vineyard, I think 3 years ago, and it's gone from there now. So I know I saw the last nesting pair here in Hadley, and that was back when I was a young teenager speaking of birding ethics at the farm, before they took the old silage silo down. It was on the west side of North Maple Street, and we didn't know any better back then, and we walked right into the silo where they were nesting. And the adult bird screamed at us. We could see the babies up there at the top of the silo, but nowadays definitely would not do that now that I know better than I did back then.
Correct. Do you want to speak a little bit to the ethics, since we're on ethics a little bit, the ethics of calling owls and trying to see them during nesting season? I got this from Lynn. I think it's one of the reasons why I'm very specifically, I call owls during the winter, because I could find out. I don't necessarily know off the top of my head when they're nesting. How do you feel about that, Dan?
Well, I like you try not to call them during nesting season. I don't necessarily call great horned owls at all during nesting season. They're just calling. Barred owls, I'll give it another month. I'll keep trying to talk to barred owls, and then I know by the late part of March, early April, they start to think about nesting, so I'll stop bothering them. Screech owls are about the same time. Not that I go out other than owl prowls a month ago. I don't go out looking for owls at any other time of the year. So I think I'm with you. I try not to call them during the nesting season. And again, I think both in the same boat, we try not to use that recording any longer than we have to bother the birds.
Excellent. All right.
You want to show the next slide?
The bullet.
Short-eared owl. We're fortunate here in the valley to have a lot of good habitat for short-eared owls. So in most winters, we see them here in the honey pot or the meadows of Northampton. Again, this is a bird that Heidi and I go out looking for. One time, David and I flushed a short-eared out of the honey pot in Hadley as we were driving through. But that's the only time I've ever had a short-eared on a Christmas bird count. When we're out in the middle of the night, that's not the time that short-eared owls are active. They're active at dawn and dusk. And very beautiful bird, flies like a moth, as most of you know, low over the fields like a harrier, dipping and diving, looking constantly for prey beneath them. And when they do see something, they'll pounce on it. And the fields, again, of Hadley and Northampton, and even Hatfield to some extent, are great places for short-eared owls. The coast is another good spot. Plum Island, Salisbury, usually there's a few short-eared owls down there as well. They like short, grassy areas. Hopefully someday the Conti Refuge will be a good place for short-eared owls as well. But it's a beautiful bird to see. But again, not one that Heidi and I are out there looking for at 2 o'clock in the morning.
Nope. And they're very easy, I think, to mistake for a hawk. They behave in a way that doesn't necessarily scream owl at you. They look like a bullet when they're flying. They have that wonderful face that's sort of flat on the front, but keeps going. They have a very distinct look to them. Once you know what they are, they're stunning to watch fly. And the honeypot is where I've seen them, like you said, flying low, right at dusk, just before, not when it's full dark, just still light, but dusk coming. So very beautiful bird.
Very long pointed wings, almost falcon-like in the wings, and very strong flyers when they are flying over the field at dusk. So next slide. Snowy owls. I would dare to say that nobody watching tonight has had a snowy owl this year. As far as I know, there are no snowy owls in Massachusetts this year. This is an eruptive species, meaning when prey is short up in the Arctic, snowy owls come south. Also, when they overproduce young because of an abundance of prey, the young birds will come south because there is not enough food in the wintertime for them. Again, not a bird that Heidi and I are looking for at 2 in the morning. This is a diurnal hunter, daytime hunter. Very beautiful when they do show up in the winter. We've had years where there's 4 or 5 of them here in the valley, and then there's years like this where there's 0. So not a year to be on the lookout for them, but hopefully next year we'll be back.
And
Anything to add?
when these birds are here, they've come a long way. They're generally the younger birds. They are not the most experienced hunters, and they are stunning. They are large. They draw a crowd, and please do not crowd them. They're inexperienced, and they many times wind up in raptor rehab. So we need to be really careful to give them their space, as they've traveled a long way to get here, and they really do need to be able to hunt successfully in order to survive this far away from where they are. People, they show up at airports, and they have groups of people removing them from airports. They're very funny when they get here because they're not a bird from here. I did want to mention, and this has a little bit to do with a book that I'm working on that'll come out in 24 or 25. I don't know. And I didn't know if you were going to talk about it at all, though. I'm on a big campaign to make people aware of how bad rodenticide is, especially for our raptors, especially for our owls. And we see too many snowy owls wind up dying or very ill because people want to poison rodents. It's the best way to poison rodents is the way that you never have to see them. So they have this poison that you can use, and that it kills them, but not right there. They go out and die out in the field. An owl will eat them, and the owl will die a horrible death if not found, and still may, because they're being poisoned, but with a lower dose. So it's a slower death. So I am on a huge kick to educate people about this. And I am assuming everybody on this call knows this, but that most people don't actually know this. So snowy owls, especially, I think we see a lot of them being poisoned because they are inexperienced hunters, and the stuff that they find is already being poisoned. So they are slower, easier prey, and out during the day. So I just wanted to add that in with snowy owls, though it's a problem with all owls.
Yeah, that's sure. We want to ban those rodenticides when we can, as soon as we can. Just to finish on snowy owls, most people know immatures have that dark barring on their chest. If you do get lucky enough to see an adult snowy, they're almost pure white. We don't see adults down here very often, unfortunately or fortunately. And quite often, as Heidi said, when these birds, they are starting. because they've flown so far. They may or may not have fed on their flight southward. And as soon as they get here, they want to be able to feed. So we definitely want to give them their space when they do show up here. The heaviest owl that we have, I forget what the actual weight is. I think it's somewhere around 15 pounds. So they are definitely built for surviving the Arctic. So hopefully next year is better. I don't know how Scott gets these shots, but he does a wonderful job.
Amazing. We do have some
Go on to the next slide.
amazing photographers in the area.
Another eruptive species, which we haven't seen here in quite a few years, for good or bad. The great gray owl is probably the largest North American species, not by weight. Snowy owl still outweighs the great gray, but purely in size. This bird is the largest. When they do come, again, they come in fairly good numbers. Scott and I both thought this might be the year because there were a few early great grays up in far northern Maine. And we thought maybe this is the year. It's been 30 years. It's time for a great gray eruption, but it didn't happen. You got to go out west if you want to see these guys on a regular basis up in the mountains, Sierra and that kind of thing. I don't know how they're handling 30 feet of snow, but I'm sure they're surviving somehow. But I can remember vividly a couple instances. One was the one over in Hadley that many people saw. It stayed there for about a month. I can remember cars lining the road, people viewing the gray. Again, back then it was telescopes and binoculars, less so cameras, so people didn't venture out into the field and disrupt the bird. They like to sit on either fence posts or the edges of fields and look for their prey, primarily voles, and then they'll fly very low over the field and pounce on them. So that's one remembrance I have of great grays. But the other was from over in Amherst at Wildwood Cemetery. There was a bird back over there on the edge of what's called Browns Field before the house is built in it. And I can definitely remember John Green there with a camera on a tripod, probably not a very big lens, but what he would do is he would throw his glove up in the air. And when the glove would hit the ground, the great gray would turn to look at the sound. And that's when John would snap the picture. So I guess he was disrupting the bird a little bit, but not nearly as much as we do nowadays.
I would have to say that the great gray was my spark bird. I mean, I'd been birding forever and knew a lot about birds, but we had one in the early 80s, and I bet it was in that same eruption that you're talking about that my dad found in Hatfield. And again, this was before we had sort of these ABA rules, and he actually made sure that nobody got close enough to it. But he definitely went to the pet store and bought mice and brought them for him, partially to keep him from starving, but also to make sure that he smiled pretty for the camera. He also traumatized his teenage daughter because all the boxes said, "I finally found a home." And that wasn't, the home was not the one that I thought that they were getting, but I digress. So this is not something we would do now. We would absolutely never do this, but it was this enormous, beautiful, very present bird, because these birds are just, they are a presence, but they are also present. They're watching you, they're looking, you can really sort of feel what they're thinking, right? And I remember it vividly. And I remember that was the first time I was really just stunned by owls and thought, well, this is something really cool.
Yeah, the way they sit on the edge of a field and they just turn that head and like Heidi said, they literally look like they're looking at you and kind of looking inside your brain to see what you're thinking when they do look at you. That's the way I remember gray owls back when we did have a few around here.
Tom Riccardi does have a great gray owl up at his, and if anybody in here doesn't know who Tom Riccardi, I know we've mentioned him several times and we sort of assume locally that everybody knows who Tom is. Tom is our raptor rehab guy up in Conway. He does an amazing job. We try and run fundraisers for him once a year, at least in different ways. He does educational bird shows. He's gruff and wonderful, and we just all absolutely love him. But so just in case anybody is on the call who doesn't know Tom, but he does have one up there. And what I love very much is the guy he's got up there has this a mustache that looks just like Tom's. Favorite thing.
I think he got that bird from Maine, actually. I think Maine Fish and Game brought that to him or got it to him because it was injured up in Maine, but I'm not positive about that.
Yep. I think it's resident. I've never seen him out on an educational, but I think I'm not sure if he's going to be released back out.
Yeah. Tom stops to see me about once a month up in Sunderland at my new gig. So I talk to him quite often once the season gets going.
I love him. I've been up there with him. He's my expert for raptor rehab because I have a couple books, one coming out and one that is being shopped that have to do with raptor rehab. So I ask him lots of questions and try and bring him money when I do.
Yeah.
Yes.
Do we have any more slides? Hawk owl.
Oh, come on. Have you seen this here?
Bees that, again, I don't know when the last time. None. Anyway, I don't know the last time one was in Massachusetts. The last time I saw one was probably 25 years ago. I was going skiing up in Vermont, and there was one about a half an hour north of where I was going skiing. So we decided to go out of our way. Again, it was with Tom Clark from over at Mount Holyoke College. We went out of our way to see the hawk owl, got it, and then put off to go skiing. Again, comes down out of Canada in certain years. This is another bird that there were a few up in northern Maine early in the winter, and Scott and I had high hopes, but they never made it south of northern Maine. Hunts like a kestrel from a perch, and when it's something, it will drop onto it like a shrike. That's another bird that they're very similar to. Very aggressive, very fast flyers, similar to a falcon. And they will grab something and not let go until they get back to a perch to eat it. Voles are their primary prey. I don't know when you've seen one or if you've seen one, Heidi.
I've never seen one. I would
Yeah.
like to see one, but I've never seen one.
Yeah. Next slide. And I guess that's the end of the program. We'll end it with a screech owl sleeping in a cavity, as we talked about. And that's kind of a perfect shot for a red-phased screech owl in the cavity. But I just want to thank Heidi for helping me with this. And hopefully, if anybody has any other questions, you can send them in now.
Otherwise, we will go outside and listen for owls in our backyard. I did think I heard my great horned owls today earlier, but I cannot confirm. All right. Well, I don't see any questions, and we have run definitely an hour and 15 minutes. So, see your message recording off. We're all good. Yeah. Thank you, Dan, for chatting with me this evening. Thank you, Dan and Janice, for inviting me. I always love to come talk to the group. Look for more of my books, featuring owls, believe it or not. And I'll see everybody at the Christmas bird count.
Yeah, thank you so much, Heidi. Thank you so much, Dan. We really appreciate it. Have a
Thank
good night,
you.
everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You too.